From a very early age, I was interested in architecture. And that in turn came from a tremendous early love of trees. And it was fascinating because when I was a young kid, I had very unusual circumstances. My father died in the war before I was born. And so I've always had this, when I look back at pictures of myself at that time, I looked quite lost. But I used to climb up into the trees and I used to notice the stars passing over the branches of trees out through the canopy. And I used to think to myself, I wonder if these branches connect these stars to each other. And I loved architecture from an early age without knowing an architect and really without knowing what it is. And so I went to architecture school at Cornell and went to New York and worked as an architect as I did in Rome. And while I was in Rome, I began to really start resonating with not just 16th century architecture, Palladio and Brunelleschi and Michelangelo, but I began getting interested in the history, more deeper history of Italy and so on. And I felt a kind of limitation arising in the architecture that architecture is about space, and it's taught that way in colleges. At that point, I went to Cornell University. And to me, it seemed very static and not very interesting. And I began to feel more and more interested in proportion systems, but also in how you move through a building. And the way you move through a building involves a time coordinate. And I felt that certain spaces of certain shapes, I was curious why they evoked particular feelings, particular images. And this really awakened an interest in astrology, which when I first came across it, I wasn't wildly impressed because of the people that I talked to about it, but I began to realize that it was actually a fourth dimensional pursuit of architecture, and that a horoscope could potentially be a four-dimensional structure of one's life through time. And this is something I've written about a lot in my Sacred Architecture book, simply because one of my more interesting usual theories is that is actually an answer to this question about the fact that the base chakra is always symbolized as a cube. So spaces that are perfect cubes resonate with the base chakra, in the same way that domes are often associated with throat chakra and crown type spaces are associated with crown chakra. Triangular spaces, and in fact even proportions that are based on triangles, evoke heart chakra. So the proportions of spaces that you're in quite literally resonate with some part of your nature. And it gradually morphed because when I came to it, I'd already read Gurdjieff and Ouspensky and Rodney Collins extensively. And they came from a kind of Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and a tradition that was actually integrating Eastern knowledge and bringing it to the West, together with very profound Sufi ideas about perception. And I was very much engaged in the Gurdjieff work when I came to astrology. So I noticed immediately that the way the horoscope was presented was extremely static. And I just decided to make some drawings to find out how it really worked. And in the process, I developed a Rodney Collins idea a bit further. And that idea is about the spiraling solar system. And the fact is that the sun actually moves around the galactic center. And this is very relevant to the 2012, although no one talks about it. Our sun moves around the galactic center. In fact, it probably moves around the star Sirius, which moves around the galactic center. So we revolve around Sirius, which in turn revolves around the galactic center. Well, the rate at which the sun moves is 500,000 miles a day, 500,000 miles a day, which means it's moving, the sun is moving at 20,000 miles an hour. And it's carrying the planets along with it. And when you represent this, it's a series of very complex spirals with a filament of the sun in the middle. And Mercury is a little tiny yellow one, and Venus is a green one, and Mars, in the Earth is a blue one. And therefore, it gives you a whole dynamic sense of how the sun moves through time, followed by the planets. The Earth itself is 90 million miles from the sun, and it moves 1 million miles a day around the sun. So we're actually moving at close to the speed of a bullet. And with this perspective, it means that a birth horoscope is simply a slice through this spiral. And in reality, it means obviously that you can extend it forward into the future and backward into the past. And so I developed a way of astrology that I call lifetime astrology, because I use this Gurdjieff and Ouspensky scale going back to conception. And I start when the parents make love to conceive a child. And this is a prototype of your sexuality, of your integration of anima and animus in a psychological sense, your path of spiritual discovery, and so on. And because you include this gestation period, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th houses, it means that basically you must understand your mother and return to the realm of the mothers. And this provoked a whole other set of processes, so that gestation is like the collective unconscious, because we relive the entire evolutionary process in the womb. And planets that register there are literally stored somatically. They're stored in your body. And this corresponds to a lot of Ken Wilber's work, for example, where there are chironic levels of reality. Well, in gestation, the 9th house is always called higher mind, for example. And in reality, in the first 7 weeks, we're basically a brain attached to a little vestigial skeletal system, and we emerge from the animal state into human state in that period of time, which is symbolized by a centaur, which is a half, a horse's body and a human torso aspiring to the sky. So it's interesting because the stages of gestation are not only psychological states, but I began making them compare to biological states. So books of mine have ranged from how to use a technique like this to Astrology and the Art of Healing, which explores the fact that you're really talking about, psychology doesn't exist on its own without a biology. We need a body. And similarly, the idea of the spiraling solar system is that I discovered it in going back to conception, that certain horoscopes seem to indicate something in the 8th house before that. And that evolved into a lot of reincarnation work, where basically you can track that spiraling solar system. But the main analogy is that the solar system moving through time, from the Earth's point of view, is a double helix, and that the structure of the moving solar system is identical to the DNA molecule. So to use the metaphor of as above, so below, in this case, it's a literal connection, because the mathematics, the structure, the form of DNA is exactly parallel to the spiraling solar system. And my postulate basically is that we resonate naturally in the microcosm of every cell with the macrocosmic movement of this spiraling solar system. And that when you're in touch, when you're connected, when you're grounded, when you have access to the spiritual, you can tap in to the mind, to the collective intelligence in each cell. And of course, because it goes back to creation, it tracks back through the mitochondrial DNA, that a woman's ovum, the women's ova that are produced in her entire lifetime are there not long after conception. And in fact, that ovum is really the ovum from which they were conceived. So effectively, a woman's initial ovum, her kind of ovum, is in fact comes from her mother, which comes from her mother, which comes from her mother. So the ovum is in fact eternal.